Chapter 1. Arrival in the Shadowed Village. The little train wheezed to a halt at the platform of Lanterna Holt, exactly as the sun balanced on the jagged ridge of the Jade Dragon Mountains. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in a travelling cloak of impeccable charcoal cashmere, stepped down, with the delicacy of a cat descending from a velvet cushion. The air was sharp with pine and something sweeter. Jasmine, perhaps, or the faint smoke of 1,000 paper lanterns already being tested for the great festival that would begin in 3 days' time. Mon Dieu, he murmured, adjusting the precise angle of his hat. One comes to the east for repose, and already the little grey cells are twitching. It is most inconvenient. A porter in indigo robes hurried forward, bowing so low that his queue nearly brushed the dusty ground. "Welcome, honourable sir, to Lanterna Village. You are the guest of Madame Li Fenglan?" "Précisément." Poirot allowed the man to take his single valise, for even on holiday, Poirot travelled with the elegance of a diplomat and the luggage of a duchess. Though I confess I know little of my hostess beyond a charming letter, written in exquisite French, and the promise of absolute tranquillity. The porter's smile flickered like a candle in a draught. "Tranquillity. Yes, of course. This way, please." The path from the station wound upward, between terraced rice fields that glowed emerald in the late light. Everywhere lanterns hung from bamboo poles, some no larger than a fist, others vast as carriage wheels, all waiting for the night when they would be lit and sent floating into the sky like a river of stars turned upside down. Children darted between them, giggling, while old women tested the strength of paper with gnarled fingers. The village itself clung to the mountainside in tiers. White walls, swallowtail eaves, red pillars gleaming. And above everything loomed the great black rock known as Dragon's Tongue, its peak lost in cloud. Poirot's moustaches bristled with approval. It is picturesque. It is perhaps too picturesque. One does not invite Hercule Poirot to a postcard unless one wishes something investigated. The porter pretended not to hear. At the crest of the hill stood the House of Li, a courtyard mansion older than the Qing dynasty, its gates lacquered vermilion and guarded by stone lions wearing garlands of fresh marigolds for the festival. Servants in silk jackets bowed as Poirot crossed the threshold. In the main hall, beneath a lattice of carved camphor wood, waited his hostess. Madame Li Fenglan was 60, perhaps 65, but carried her years like a queen. Her hair was coiled in the severe style of the old court, pinned with a single jade phoenix. She wore mourning white, yet the silk was so fine it shimmered like moonlight on water. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, inclining her head with perfect French grace, "you honour my unworthy house." "The honour is entirely mine, madam." Poirot bowed, clicked his heels, and allowed his gaze to travel once, swiftly, around the hall. He noted the ancestors' portraits staring down in disapproval, the faint scent of sandalwood incense, and, most interesting of all, the way Madame Li's left hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she gestured toward a rosewood chair. "You wrote that you required peace after the unfortunate affair in Istanbul," she continued, pouring tea the colour of burnished amber. "Here, during the Lantern Festival, we have only music, fireworks, and the gentle ascent of 10,000 wishes into heaven." Poirot accepted the porcelain cup with a murmur of thanks. "One is grateful. Yet I detect, madame, a shadow behind your courtesy. The eyes of Hercule Poirot, they see much." For a moment, the only sound was the distant chime of wind bells. Then Madame Li set down her own cup with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. "My eldest son, Li Wei-shan, believes someone intends to ruin the festival," she said quietly. "He insists I am an old woman, frightened by fireworks. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I merely wished for the company of the greatest detective in Europe, so that if something should happen, there would be someone present who is accustomed to darkness." Poirot sipped his tea. It was fragrant, expensive, and, he noted with the small corner of his mind that never slept, contained the faintest trace of star anise, often used to mask bitterness. "Tell me of this festival," he said mildly. Madame Li's voice softened, as though reciting a bedtime tale to a favourite grandchild. "Every year, on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month, we honour the dead and pray for the living. Families write their heart's desires on lanterns and release them over the mirror lake. The one who sends the highest lantern will have his wish granted, or so the legend claims. This year the festival is special. It is the 200th anniversary of the founding of Lanterna. My family has sponsored it for 7 generations. Thousands will come. Merchants from Shanghai, scholars from Beijing, even foreigners like yourself. And your son fears sabotage? He fears murder," she corrected, so softly Poirot almost missed it. "There have been letters, threats, a lantern sent to the house with black paper instead of gold, and inside a single white chrysanthemum. In China, monsieur, white chrysanthemums are for funerals." Poirot placed his cup precisely in its saucer. "And yet you did not summon the police? The provincial governor is my husband's cousin. To involve him would be to admit weakness before the entire province. Lanterna must appear united, prosperous, joyful." Her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. "If there is danger, better it be faced by one who understands the twisted minds of men." From the courtyard came the sudden laughter of children testing a paper dragon that belched sparks. The Shigai sound was bright, almost cruel in its innocence. Poirot rose. "Then I accept your hospitality, madame, and whatever small shadows may lurk within it. Show me to my room. I must unpack my slippers. They are of vital importance to the little grey cells. And tonight, perhaps, I will walk among your lanterns. One learns much from the play of light upon guilty faces." Madame Li summoned a maid, a grave girl with eyes as dark as wet ink. As Poirot followed her through corridors, where moonlight already striped the floor like tiger bars, he paused once to study a niche in the wall. There stood a small household shrine, incense ashes still warm, a bowl of rice, 3 oranges, and curious detail, a single red lantern no larger than an apple, its paper torn as though by frantic fingers. The maid noticed his glance. "That belonged to the young master," she whispered, "Master Li Jian, the second son. He has not been home in 3 years. Some say he is dead. Others say he is only waiting." "Waiting?" Poirot's voice was silk over steel. "For the festival, honourable sir. For the night when all lanterns rise, and some wishes fall." She bowed and hurried away. Poirot entered his chamber, simple, austere, perfect, and closed the latticed door. For a long moment he stood motionless, eyes half closed, moustaches quivering like the antennae of some fastidious insect. "Tiens," he said at last to the empty room, "a family divided, a festival of light that casts many shadows, and already one torn lantern and the scent of funeral flowers. It is not tranquillity I have been invited to, mes amis. It is murder." Outside, far below in the village, the first trial lantern of the evening lifted into the sky, small, brave, glowing gold against the indigo dusk. It rose higher and higher until it became indistinguishable from the emerging stars. Hercule Poirot watched it until it vanished, and smiled a small, dangerous smile. The game, as they say, had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers among the lantern makers. The next morning, Hercule Poirot descended from the house of Lee at an hour that the village clearly considered indecently early. The sun had only just cleared the Dragon's Tongue, and mist still clung to the rice terraces like the breath of sleeping ghosts. Yet the narrow lanes already hummed with industry. Hammers tapped on bamboo frames, the hiss of glue pots, the rustle of coloured tissue being cut into phoenix wings and lotus petals. Poirot walked with the measured gait of a man who has dressed with care, even for a murder investigation. His dove-grey suit was immaculate, his spats gleaming, his cane tapping a soft rhythm on the stone as villagers paused to stare. A few bowed. One old woman spat discreetly into the dust and made the sign against evil spirits. Poirot noticed everything and appeared to notice nothing. He was bound for the Lantern Quarter, a warren of courtyards behind the temple of the river goddess, where the finest lanterns in the province were born. Madame Lee had given him a jade token, the Lee family crest carved in miniature, that would open every door. She had also, with exquisite politeness, begged him not to use it unless absolutely necessary. "Necessary," Poirot had replied, twirling the token on its silk cord, "is what Hercule Poirot decides it is." The first courtyard belonged to Master Zhao, the most celebrated lantern-maker in Lanterna. His signboard, crimson letters on black lacquer, proclaimed Zhao and Sons, lanterns that touch heaven since the reign of Qianlong. Beneath it, 3 generations of Zhao men worked in silent concentration. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 15, painted a dragon's eye with a brush held between his toes, because both hands were busy tying knots in gold wire. Master Zhao himself, lean 70, beard like spilled ink, looked up as Poirot's shadow crossed the threshold. "Foreign devil," he said without heat in careful Mandarin. Then, seeing the jade token, his expression changed to something between fear and calculation. "The Lee family honours my humble roof." "Only for a moment," Poirot replied in flawless court French, which made the old man blink. Switching to Mandarin that carried the faintest Belgian lilt, he continued, "I admire beauty, Master Zhao. And your lanterns, mon Dieu, they are masterpieces. Tell me, do you make one every year for the Lee family itself? A special lantern, perhaps?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "Every year for 7 generations. This year the design is unusual." He led Poirot past racks of half-finished globes to a separate shed sealed with a red paper talisman. Inside, on a low table, rested a lantern unlike any Poirot had yet seen. It was enormous, tall as a man, shaped like a perfect sphere of midnight blue paper, painted with silver constellations. At its heart glowed a single candle, already fitted, though the festival was still 2 nights away. "It is called the Star-Returning Lantern," Master Zhao said quietly. "Only one is ever made. The head of the Lee family writes a secret wish upon rice paper, seals it inside, and on the final night releases it above Mirror Lake. Legend says that lantern never falls. It returns to the stars from which the first Lee ancestor descended." Poirot bent closer. The constellations were accurate: Orion, the Great Bear, the Pleiades. But one star, in the constellation of the Dragon, had been painted crimson instead of silver. "A mistake?" he asked softly. Master Zhao's fingers twitched. "A request. From the second son, Li Jian, 3 years ago. He paid in advance, in gold, said the red star must be there when he came home." "And has he come home?" The old man's silence was answer enough. From the doorway came a woman's voice, low, amused, edged with danger. Asking questions already, little foreigner? The festival has not even begun." Poirot turned. The speaker leaned against the peau frame as though she owned the very air. She was perhaps 30, dressed in the working clothes of a lantern painter, indigo jacket, rolled sleeves, hair tied back with a strip of scarlet cloth. Yet there was nothing servile about her. Her eyes were the colour of wet slate, and a tiny jade cicada hung from one ear. "Allow me," she said, stepping forward. "Mei Ling, apprentice to Master Zhao, though some say more than apprentice." She smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "And you are the famous detective Madame Li keeps hidden like a pet monkey." "Enchanté," Poirot said, bowing with perfect gravity. "Though monkeys, mademoiselle, are known for their curiosity, and their ability to see what others miss." Mei Ling laughed outright. "Come then. If you want gossip with your beauty, the lotus-binding courtyard is better. There the women work, and women always know where the bodies are buried." She led him through a maze of alleys to a smaller yard where a dozen women sat cross-legged, stitching silk gauze over bamboo ribs. The air smelled of rice glue and jasmine oil. Conversation stopped the instant Poirot appeared, then resumed in a rustle of whispers. Mei Ling clapped her hands. "Sisters, the Li family's foreign devil wishes to admire our humble efforts. Who will show him the Phoenix of 9 Sorrows?" An older woman with a scar across her cheek brought forward a lantern shaped like a phoenix rising from flames. Its wings were layered tissue, crimson fading to gold, so delicate they trembled in the breeze. "Beautiful," Poirot murmured, "and sorrowful. 9 sorrows, you say?" "Each feather represents a tragedy in the Li family," the scarred woman replied. "The first sorrow, the ancestor who lost his name. The 9th. She stopped, glancing at Mei Ling. "The 9th is still being written," Mei Ling finished. "Some say it will be a death. Others say a birth. Lanterns carry truth, monsieur. That is why certain people fear them." Poirot's gaze moved across the courtyard. In one corner, a girl of 16 or 17 worked alone, her fingers flying as she painted tiny characters onto strips of red paper. Unlike the others, she did not look up. "And that child?" he asked. Mei Ling's voice dropped. "Little Swallow, orphan, best calligrapher in Lanterna. She writes the wishes that go inside the richest patron's lanterns. Whatever is written in her hand is said to come true twice as fast." A pause. "Last year she wrote a wish for Master Li Jian. No one knows what it said, but the lantern burst into flames the moment it left his hand. A bad omen." Poirot approached the girl. She kept working, head bowed, but he saw her shoulders stiffen. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," he said gently. "Might I see your brush?" Reluctantly, she held it out, a fine wolf-hair brush worn almost to the ferrule. On the scrap of paper before her she had written over and over in characters so small they seemed spider silk. "Return what was stolen, or the river takes its price." Poirot felt the familiar tingle at the base of his skull. He was about to speak when a sudden commotion erupted at the courtyard entrance. A young man strode in, tall, city-suited, hair cut short in the modern style. His face was handsome in the way of film stars, but the eyes were too bright, the mouth too tight. "Mei Ling," he called imperiously, "my mother wants you at the house immediately. Something about the star-returning lantern." Mei Ling's expression turned to stone. "Tell Madame Li I will come when I have finished my work, Li Weishan. Or does the eldest son now fetch and carry like a servant?" The man's lips thinned. For a moment Poirot thought he would strike her. Instead, he noticed the detective and forced a smile that did not fit his face. "Monsieur Poirot, I did not expect to see you mingling with the artisans." "One learns more from those who create," Poirot replied mildly, "than from those who merely inherit." Li Wei-shan flushed dark red. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left. The women exhaled as one. Mei Ling watched him go, something unreadable in her eyes. "The eldest son fears the festival," she said at last. "He fears what the lanterns may reveal when they rise. Some secrets burn brighter than candles, monsieur." Poirot tapped his cane thoughtfully against the stones. Around him, the women returned to their work, but the rhythm had changed, faster, nervous. High above, a string of tiny trial lanterns someone had released too early drifted across the sky like a necklace of fireflies. He tucked Little Swallow's scrap of paper into his waistcoat pocket when no one was looking. "Indeed," he said softly, "some secrets burn, and Hercule Poirot, he is very good with matches." Far off, the temple drum began to beat the hour. The sound rolled down the valley like distant thunder, and every lantern maker in the courtyard paused for a single heartbeat, as though listening for footsteps that had not yet arrived. Chapter 3. The Grand Illumination Ceremony. The night of the first grand illumination arrived like a fever dream. Mirror Lake lay at the foot of Lanterna Village, a perfect oval of black glass ringed by willow and stone lanterns older than the Republic. By late afternoon, the banks were already packed shoulder to shoulder. Silk-robed merchants from Canton, scholars in long gowns, giggling girls with flowers in their hair, foreign tourists in tropical linen clutching Kodak cameras, even a party of French missionaries who crossed themselves whenever a rocket hissed skyward. Hercule Poirot stood on the marble terrace of the Li family's riverside pavilion, a privileged island above the throng. From here, the entire festival spread beneath him like a living tapestry. Thousands of lanterns, red, gold, emerald, sapphire, bobbed on poles or floated on the water itself, their reflections trembling whenever a carp rose for insects. Paper dragons 30 feet long writhed through the crowd, manipulated by teams of shouting boys. The air smelled of gunpowder, lotus incense, and hot sesame cakes. Madame Li, at his elbow, wore ceremonial crimson for the first time since Poirot's arrival. The colour made her look 10 years younger and twice as dangerous. "Tonight is only the opening," she murmured. "We light the lake lanterns and send the small wishes. Tomorrow, the sky belongs to lovers. The final night—" She did not finish. "The final night belongs to the star-returning lantern," Poirot completed, "and to secrets." She gave him a sharp glance but said nothing. Below them, on a floating platform draped in yellow silk, the provincial governor, a stout man sweating through his Mandarin jacket, was preparing to give the signal. Musicians tuned erhu and pipa. Temple drums throbbed like a giant heartbeat. At the stroke of 9, the governor struck an enormous bronze gong. Silence fell so complete that Poirot heard the creak of lantern wires in the breeze. Then, all at once, 10,000 flames were touched to 10,000 wicks. The lake ignited. It was as though someone had spilled a galaxy across the water. Lanterns of every size and shape drifted outward from the banks, colliding gently, forming rivers of fire that flowed toward the center. Children shrieked with delight. Lovers clasped hands. Old men wept openly. High above, the first fireworks blossomed. Golden chrysanthemums, crimson peonies, green weeping willows, their reflections shattering and reforming on the water. Poirot's eyes, however, were not on the beauty. He was watching people. On the far bank, Li Wei-shan stood rigid among a knot of Shanghai businessmen, drinking champagne as though it were medicine. Nearby, Mei Ling moved through the crowd in a sleeveless emerald dress, that caused a small riot of turned heads. She carried no lantern, only a single white chrysanthemum tucked behind one ear. Master Zhao and his sons had a prime position near the governor's barge, ready to release a flotilla of miniature dragon boats made of translucent rice paper. Little Swallow, the orphan calligrapher, was nowhere to be seen. And then Poirot saw him. A tall figure in a dark European overcoat, hat pulled low, standing alone at the very edge of the light. The man's posture was unmistakable. Shoulders slightly hunched, the way a soldier stands when he is no longer a soldier. For one heartbeat, the stranger lifted his face toward the Li Pavilion, and the fireworks painted his features bronze. Li Jian, the missing second son. Poirot's hand tightened on his cane. Before he could move, the man melted back into the crowd as smoothly as a shadow into night. "Madame!" Poirot began urgently. But at that instant, a woman's scream sliced through the festival din. It came from the water. Every head turned. The music faltered and died. In the center of the lake, among the drifting lanterns, something large and dark floated face down. At first, many thought it was a prank. Someone's coat, a broken raft. Then a current turned the body, and the paper lantern tied around its neck blazed suddenly brighter, as though feeding on horror. A man's body. Silk robe of imperial yellow, the color reserved for the festival host. Face swollen, eyes staring blindly at the fireworks that still burst overhead. The crowd's silence shattered into pandemonium. Poirot was already moving. He pushed through the pavilion's silk curtains, down the private staircase that led to the Li family's dragon boat, long, low, painted scarlet and gold. Two oarsmen waited, terrified. "To the body! Vite!" The boat cut across the lake like a knife. Around them lanterns bobbed and spun, some catching fire from the corpse's own flaming ornament. Poirot knelt in the prow, scanning the water with the intensity of a hawk. They reached the body in less than a minute. One oarsman hooked the corpse with a boat pole. Together they hauled it aboard. Water streamed from the sodden robes. The lantern tied to the neck, a small, exquisite thing of black paper painted with a single crimson dragon, still burned with unnatural steadiness. Poirot leaned close. The dead man's face was distorted by poison or terror, but recognizable. Master Zhao, the greatest lantern-maker in Lanterna. And carved into the dead man's forehead with what must have been a calligraphy knife were 3 Chinese characters, still wet with blood. Fanbo Shengqian, return my stars. The same phrase Little Swallow had written 100 times that morning. Poirot looked up. On the distant bank, where Master Zhao's family had stood moments earlier, there was now only emptiness. The suns had vanished. So had Mei Ling. A rocket screamed overhead and burst into a rain of silver tears. Poirot sat back on his heels, water pooling around his patent shoes, and addressed the corpse with grave courtesy. "Mon ami, you have been most inconsiderate. To die so publicly, on the very night the lake becomes a mirror for murder. But do not fear. Hercule Poirot is here, and he will read the message you carry, both the one written in blood and the one still burning in this clever little lantern." He carefully untied the black lantern from the dead man's neck. Inside, instead of a wish, someone had placed a single object. A tiny star, cut from ruby-red glass, no larger than a raindrop. Poirot closed his fist around it. Somewhere in the screaming, chaotic crowd, a second lantern, this one pure white, rose suddenly into the sky, climbing higher than any other, as though racing for the moon. Poirot watched it go, eyes narrowed against the glare of 10,000 flames. "Tiens," he whispered, The game accelerates, and already the board is missing several pieces. Behind him, the festival burned on, beautiful and terrible, while Master Zhao's body cooled between his feet, and the first drops of festival rain began to hiss against the lanterns. Chapter 4. Interrogating the Festival Hosts. The House of Li had never known such a night. By the time Poirot returned from the lake, soaked to the knees and carrying Master Zhao's corpse wrapped in a festival banner, the great courtyard had become a battlefield of panic and protocol. Servants ran with lanterns that shook like frightened birds. The provincial governor's sedan chair had already vanished toward the safety of the prefecture. Somewhere, a woman was screaming in steady mechanical sobs. Madame Li stood at the foot of the ancestral hall steps, white-faced but upright, flanked by her eldest son Li Weishan, and a dozen house guards in ceremonial armor that had not been worn since the Boxer Rebellion. When she saw the body, her hand rose to her lips for only a second. Then it fell. "Bring him inside," she commanded, voice steady. "The Hall of Returning Cranes, clear it." The guards obeyed instantly. Poirot followed, the small black lantern and its ruby star hidden in his pocket. The Hall of Returning Cranes was the oldest part of the mansion. Black teak pillars carved with birds in flight, a floor of polished stone worn hollow by centuries of filial knees. Master Zhao's body was laid upon a low ebony table, usually reserved for incense offerings. Someone had closed his eyes. Someone else had placed 2 coins on the lids for the ferryman across the Yellow River. Madame Li dismissed the servants with a single gesture. Only 4 remained. Herself, Li Weishan, Poirot, and to Poirot's quiet satisfaction, Captain Hastings, who had arrived from Shanghai that very afternoon, and was now looking delightfully bewildered in evening dress. "Close the doors," Madame Li said. They shut with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid. Li Weishan rounded on Poirot the moment privacy was secured. "This is an outrage. Master Zhao was a loyal retainer for 50 years. To suggest—" "I suggest nothing yet," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "I observe, and what I observe, monsieur, is that your loyal retainer was poisoned with a rare distillation of monkshood. A poison that takes exactly 20 minutes to kill, no more, no less. And then placed in the lake at the precise moment 10,000 lanterns were lit. That is not the work of a madman. That is choreography." He turned to Madame Li. "The characters carved on his forehead return my stars. They are the same words written by the orphan girl, Little Swallow, yes?" Madame Li's composure cracked for the first time. "Little Swallow is a child who wrote wishes for every important lantern in Lanterna," Poirot cut in, "including, I suspect, the black one tied to Master Zhao's neck, and who vanished the instant the body was discovered." Li Weishan's fists clenched. "You will not harass a defenseless orphan while you what?" A new voice asked from the shadows. Mei Ling stepped into the lamplight as though she had been waiting behind the pillars all along. She had changed from her emerald dress into plain black trousers and jacket. Mourning or camouflage, Poirot could not yet decide. The white chrysanthemum was gone from her hair. "I saw everything," she said flatly, "from the Eastern Pier. Master Zhao was alive an hour before the illumination. He came to me secretly, trembling. He said the star-returning lantern had been tampered with, that someone had replaced the family's sacred wish with something else." Li Weishan took a step toward her. "You lying! Enough!" Madame Li's voice cracked like a whip. She turned to Poirot. suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. "Ask what you must, Monsieur Poirot, but quickly. Dawn is only hours away. And by then the entire province will know the Lee family has blood on its festival." Poirot inclined his head. "Bien, we begin with alibis. Simple, non?" He moved to the centre of the hall, placing himself between the living and the dead, like a small, impeccable judge. "Madame Lee, from 8 o'clock until the scream. I was in the women's pavilion with the governor's wife and 20 matrons of the province. You may ask any of them." "Captain Hastings?" Hastings cleared his throat. Just arrived on the funicular at 7:30. Went straight to the main pavilion to find you, old chap. Dozens saw me." "Bon." Poirot's gaze settled on Li Wei-shan. "And you, monsieur?" The eldest son lifted his chin. "I was hosting the Shanghai delegation near the musicians' stage. 50 witnesses, including 2 foreign newspaper reporters." Poirot's smile was gentle, terrible. 50 witnesses who were watching fireworks, drinking champagne, and trying to impress one another. A man may step away for 20 minutes and return without remark, especially if he wears the yellow robe of the festival host, which Master Zhao also wore tonight, I believe. Li Wei-shan went very still. Madame Li's voice was almost inaudible. "Wei-shan was with me in the pavilion from the first gong until the body was found. I myself poured his wine." Poirot absorbed this without comment. He turned to Mei Ling. "And you, mademoiselle?" "I was on the Eastern Pier, repairing a torn dragon lantern for the children's parade." "Ask the papermaker's wife. She lent me glue." Poirot nodded slowly. Then, with the suddenness of a conjurer, he produced the black lantern from his pocket and held it aloft. This was tied around the dead man's neck. Inside, a ruby star. Outside, a crimson dragon identical to the one Master Zhao was painting on the star-returning lantern this very week. Someone wished him to carry a message into death. Someone who knew the old legend that a soul murdered during the festival must deliver its killer's name to the heavens. He let the silence stretch until it screamed. Li Wei-shan broke first. "My brother," he said hoarsely. "Jian is alive. I saw him tonight, near the Willow Bridge. He wore a dark coat and a foreign hat. He looked at me and smiled." Madame Li swayed but did not fall. Poirot's eyes glittered. The prodigal son returns at last, and on the night the greatest lantern-maker dies, with his family's motto carved into his flesh. Curious timing. He knelt beside Master Zhao's body, gently lifting the dead man's right hand. Beneath the nails was a trace of brilliant indigo pigment, the exact shade used only for the star-returning lantern's constellations. "Master Zhao fought his killer," Poirot murmured. "He scratched at a robe dyed with sacred pigment no outsider could obtain. A robe belonging, perhaps, to the one who will release the great lantern on the final night." He rose and faced the family. "Someone in this house, someone with access to monkshood, to sacred dyes, to the most private wishes of the Li family, murdered Master Zhao to prevent a secret from rising with the star-returning lantern. And they carved a message meant for Li Jian, the missing brother who may, or may not, be missing any longer." Madame Li's voice was a thread. "What secret?" Poirot looked at her almost with pity. "That, madame, is what the next 2 nights will reveal. Because unless Hercule Poirot is very much mistaken, Master Zhao will not be the last to die beneath the lanterns." From the courtyard came the sudden, frantic clang of a gong, 3 urgent strokes. A servant burst through the doors without ceremony. "Honoured ones, the orphan girl, Little Swallow, she has been found on the temple of the river goddess, hanging from the sacred cypress. And in her hand? The man could not finish. Poirot was already moving. "Non," he said over his shoulder, voice like flint. "Not hanging, displayed, come, the second act begins." Behind him, the black lantern on the table flickered once, as though a breath had passed through the hall that no living person had made. Chapter 5. Clues in the glowing night market. The rain that had threatened all evening finally arrived as Poirot and Captain Hastings hurried down the slick stone steps from the House of Lee toward the village. It came in sudden, tropical violence, hissing on 10,000 lanterns, turning the streets into black mirrors that reflected fire and shadow in broken pieces. Paper dragons sagged, fireworks were abandoned, the festival crowd scattered like startled fish. Yet the night market refused to die. Stalls had pulled down their bamboo awnings and lit oil lamps that glowed through the downpour like defiant eyes. Vendors shouted their wares louder than ever. Hot ginger tea, paper umbrellas painted with phoenixes, skewers of scorpion on sticks for the brave. Somewhere, a blind musician kept playing the erhu, the notes sliding through the rain like silver knives. Poirot moved quickly despite the weather. His potent shoes were ruined, his moustache drooping tragically, but the little grey cells burned brighter than any lantern. "Little Swallow did not hang herself, Hastings," he said as they plunged into the throng. "A child who writes wishes for the richest men in the province does not suddenly choose suicide on the eve of the greatest festival. Non. She was placed there, another message, another lantern. We must reach the temple before the rain destroys what the killer wishes us to see." They found the temple of the river goddess at the far end of the market, perched on a rocky outcrop above the swollen river. Red gates stood open. Paper prayer strips fluttered like dying moths. A knot of villagers huddled beneath the eaves, faces pale, whispering. The sacred cypress grew in the center of the courtyard, an ancient tree said to have been planted by the first Lee ancestor. From its lowest branch hung the body of Little Swallow. She was barefoot, dressed in the simple blue tunic of an apprentice. A red silk cord, the kind used to bind festival lanterns, had been looped twice around her slender neck and tied to the branch with a perfect bow. Her toes pointed downward, inches from a wooden crate placed deliberately beneath her feet. If she had stood on it, she would have lived. Someone had wanted her death to look like despair. But the most chilling detail was in her right hand, clutched so tightly that even death had not loosened her fingers, was a half-finished lantern of pure white paper. On it, in her own exquisite calligraphy, were written the same 3 characters carved into Master Zhao's forehead: "Fanwo Xingchen return my stars." And beneath them, in fresh vermilion ink that had not yet run in the rain, "Tonight the river takes its price." Captain Hastings made a small, sick sound. Poirot's face was grim. "Observe, mon ami. The knot is tied at the back, impossible for a hanging suicide. The crate is exactly the height of the stone tables in the lantern-maker's courtyard, and the ink is still wet. She wrote this after she was already dead, or, more likely, someone held the brush in her dead hand and forced the message." He stepped closer, rain streaming from the brim of his hat, and gently pried the white lantern from the girl's fingers. Inside, instead of a candle, lay a single object, a tiny star cut from black paper, its edges dipped in gold. The same shape as the ruby star found on Master Zhao, but reversed, light for dark, dark for light. A temple monk appeared, trembling with incense and terror. "Honored sir, the girl was found less than an hour ago. No one saw—" "Someone saw," Poirot interrupted. "Someone always sees. Captain Hastings, the market, quickly. We search for anyone selling black paper stars, or vermilion ink thick enough to withstand rain. They plunged back into the market's glowing arteries. The rain had thinned the crowds, but not emptied them. Drunken students sang, revolutionary songs under awnings, a fortune-teller with a pet monkey huddled over his cards. An old woman sold glowing goldfish in glass bowls. Poirot's eyes flicked everywhere. Near the noodle seller's stall, he stopped. A vendor he had not noticed before sat beneath a lantern painted with black dragons. On his table lay trays of paper cutouts, bats for luck, butterflies for love, and, Poirot's breath caught, dozens of tiny stars exactly like the one in Little Swallow's lantern. Some black, some gold, some half and half. The vendor was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, an old injury healed white. Poirot approached casually. "Beautiful work, mon frère. These stars, do many buy them tonight?" The man glanced up. His eyes were milky with cataract but cunning. Only one customer. Tall man in a dark foreign coat. Paid in silver dollars, no questions. Wanted 20 black, 20 gold. Said they were for a game with the river goddess. Hastings leaned in excitedly. Did he give a name? The vendor shrugged. Names are wind, but he left something behind. He reached beneath the table and produced a sodden European-style hat. Black felt, expensive, the lining embroidered with the initials LJ, Ligian. Poirot took the hat, turning it thoughtfully. Inside the crown, tucked into the leather band, was a folded scrap of rice paper. On it, in hurried characters, "The second sorrow is paid. The third comes at moonrise tomorrow. Return what was stolen, brother, or the river will take everything." At that moment, a scream rose from the direction of the river, not terror this time, but raw, animal grief. Poirot was running before the echo died. They burst through a bamboo curtain into a narrow alley that ended at the water's edge. There, kneeling in the mud, was Mei Ling. She held something in her arms, something small and broken. It was the body of Master Zhao's youngest son, the boy who had painted the dragon's eye with his toes that morning. He could not have been more than 15. His throat had been cut with a single, precise stroke. In his right hand he clutched a lantern fragment, midnight blue paper painted with silver constellations. The constellation of the dragon was missing its crimson star. Someone had torn it out. Mei Ling looked up at Poirot. Rain and tears had washed the paint from her face, leaving her terrifyingly young. "They left him for me to find," she whispered. "There was a note pinned to his jacket with a calligraphy knife." She held it out. Written in blood, still warm. 1 lantern for every sorrow, 7 still remain. Poirot stared at the note, then at the 3 bodies that now lay between him and the solution. Master Zhao, Little Swallow the boy. All connected by stars. All connected by the ancient Li family lantern that would rise or fall on the final night. He became aware that the rain had stopped as suddenly as it began. Above them, the clouds parted and the moon, full, swollen, the colour of fresh blood, looked down on Lanterna like an unblinking eye. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells began to toll midnight. Poirot folded the bloodied note with delicate precision and placed it in his pocket beside the black paper star. "Tomorrow is the night of lovers," he said quietly. "The night when 10,000 red lanterns rise for romance and longing. But for someone in this village, mon ami, tomorrow will be the night of the third sorrow." He looked toward the dark bulk of the House of Li on the hill, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. And Hercule Poirot intends to be there when the next lantern is lit, whether it carries a wish or a corpse. Behind him, the night market's lamps begin to gutter one by one, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Chapter 6. The Secret of the Forbidden Pavilion. The storm had passed, but the mountain air remained cold and sharp, tasting of wet pine and gunpowder residue. Dawn was still 2 hours away when Poirot, wrapped in a borrowed indigo cloak that made him look like a very fastidious monk, slipped out of the guest wing of the House of Lee. He carried no lantern. The moon was more than enough. His destination lay behind the ancestral hall, a small octagonal pavilion half swallowed by wisteria, its vermilion paint long faded to the colour of dried blood. The Forbidden Pavilion, the servants called it. No one had entered it since Li Jian vanished 3 years earlier. Even Madame Li spoke of it only in whispers, as though the building itself might overhear. Poirot had watched from his window an hour earlier as a single candle flared inside, then vanished. Someone else had decided the pavilion's secrets could wait no longer. He moved along the covered walkway that skirted the lotus pond. Koi, disturbed by his footsteps, flashed white beneath the surface like ghosts of drowned wishes. At the pavilion door, heavy cedar bound with iron, he paused. The lock was new, European, expensive, child's play. From his waistcoat he produced a slender pick and a tiny torch. 30 seconds later, the lock sighed open. Inside smelled of dust, camphor, and something metallic, old blood, perhaps, or merely rust. Moonlight fell through 8 lattice windows in perfect silver bars across the floor. In the centre stood a rosewood table. Upon it, a single oil lamp freshly lit, and an open teak box lined with faded yellow silk. Poirot's breath caught. The box was built to hold the star-returning lantern when it was not being prepared for flight. But the lantern itself was missing. In its place lay a stack of letters tied with black cord, and beside them a small lacquered tray bearing 3 objects. A dried white chrysanthemum, its petals edged brown. A lock of black hair bound with red thread. A child's finger bone, polished smooth by years of handling. Poirot's moustache bristled with distaste and excitement in equal measure. He untied the letters. The top one was addressed in Li Jian's bold, impatient hand. To the thief who stole my birthright, read these and weep. On the night the star-returning lantern rises, I will take back what is mine with fire if necessary. The remaining letters, 23 in all, were written by different hands, some in refined classical Chinese, others in crude dialect, 2 in French. Poirot read swiftly. They told a story more savage than any village legend. 7 generations ago, the founding ancestor of the Li family had not descended from the stars, as the festival myth claimed. He had been a pirate who raided a Manchu prince's barge on Mirror Lake, murdered the entire retinue, and stolen a chest of imperial jewels. Among them was a single ruby carved into a perfect star, the heart of the dragon sacred to the emperor himself. The pirate buried most of the treasure beneath the newly built House of Li, forged a noble genealogy, and founded a dynasty. Every century, on the festival's final night, the current head of the family was supposed to place 1 jewel back into the star-returning lantern as atonement. The lantern would rise, the ancestors would be appeased, prosperity would continue. But 25 years earlier, Madame Li's husband, drunk on power and opium, had refused. He kept the final ruby star for himself, hid it, and died suddenly of heart failure 3 months later. The letters claimed Li Jian had discovered the truth. He demanded the ruby returned to the lantern, or he would expose the family and destroy the festival forever. Madame Li refused. Li Wei-shan, fearing disgrace and loss of inheritance, had arranged for his younger brother to disappear. Officially, an accident in Shanghai. Unofficially, something far worse. The last letter, dated 3 years ago, was written in Li Jian's blood. "Mother, brother, you have chosen. I choose the river, but rivers remember. When the next star-returning lantern rises, it will carry fire instead of wishes, and the house of Li will burn like paper." At the bottom, someone, Madame Li, had scrawled a single line in shaking characters. "Forgive us, the ruby is lost." Poirot closed the box with deliberate care. The finger bone, he now realized, was too small to belong to an adult. A child's, perhaps the pirate ancestor's first victim. He was about to leave when a floorboard creaked behind him. Mei Ling stood in the doorway barefoot, dressed in black, a lantern knife glinting in her hand. "You should not be here, little foreigner," she said softly. "Nor you, mademoiselle." Poirot did not move. Yet here we both are, reading the same unhappy family history. She stepped inside, closing the door with her heel. Moonlight painted silver on the blade. "Li Jian was my lover," she said. "Did you guess? He taught me to read French poetry under this very roof. He promised we would leave together once he forced his mother to return the ruby. When he vanished, I thought him dead. Then the murders began, and I knew he had come back, not as a son, but as vengeance." Her voice trembled, but the knife did not. "3 dead already," Poirot said gently. "Master Zhao, because he knew where the ruby was hidden inside the lantern frame. Little Swallow, because she wrote the warnings. The boy, because he saw too much. How many more must die for one stolen stone?" Mei Ling's eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "He is not the same man I loved. The river changed him. Or perhaps it only woke what was always there." She raised the knife, not to strike Poirot, he realized, but to show him the blade. Etched along its steel were tiny constellations. The dragon was missing its crimson star. "I was to deliver the 4th sorrow tonight," she whispered, "Li Wei-shan in his sleep. Jian waits for me at the old smuggler's cave beneath Dragon's Tongue. If I do not come—" She let the sentence hang like incense. Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "You have a choice, mademoiselle. Help me stop him before the final night, and perhaps Li Jian can still be saved from becoming the monster his brother tried to make him. Or follow him into the dark, and the river will indeed take everything, including you." Mei Ling stared at the knife as though seeing it for the first time. Slowly, deliberately, she reversed it and offered him the handle. "Take me to Madame Li," she said, voice breaking, "before I change my mind." Poirot accepted the knife. Together they stepped out into the moon-drenched garden. Behind them, in the forbidden pavilion, the oil lamp suddenly flared high, then died, as though an unseen hand had passed through the room and extinguished the last secret it contained. Far above, on the black shoulder of Dragon's Tongue, a single red lantern rose, without wind or hand to guide it. Small, terrible, climbing straight toward the sinking moon. Poirot watched it go. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "is the night of lovers. Let us hope, mademoiselle, that love proves stronger than vengeance, or we shall all burn when the great lantern finally rises." Chapter 7. Allies and Adversaries in the Mist. A thin, cold mist slid down from the Jade Dragon Mountains just before dawn, wrapping Lanterna in cotton silence. The village looked as though it had been erased. Red gates became ghosts of themselves. Paper dragons hung like drowned serpents. And every lantern that still burned seemed to float in mid-air, disembodied. Hercule Poirot, stood on the covered bridge that crossed the upper stream, waiting. He wore a long Chinese coat of dark blue silk over his European suit, an absurd combination, yet somehow he made it appear inevitable. In his gloved hand, he held Mei Ling's lantern knife. In his pocket, the blood-stained note that promised a third sorrow at moonrise. He had not slept. No one in the house of Li had slept. Footsteps sounded behind him, soft, deliberate. Captain Hastings appeared out of the mist, accompanied by a man Poirot had summoned by urgent telegram the previous night. Inspector Zhang Wei of the Provincial Police, a thin, scholarly officer with round spectacles and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many festivals end in blood. "You are certain of the girl's story?" Zhang asked without greeting. "As certain as one can be when love and murder share the same bed," Poirot replied. "Mei Ling is in the women's pavilion under guard, her own request. She will lead us to the smuggler's cave at dusk, when Li Jian expects her to bring Li Weishan's heart in a lacquer box. Instead, she will bring us." Zhang's mouth twisted. "And if the brother shoots first?" "Then Hercule Poirot will have miscalculated," he said cheerfully, "which would be intolerable. Therefore, he will not shoot." Hastings cleared his throat. "There's something else, Poirot. While you were interrogating the mist, I took a turn round the lantern-maker's quarter. Someone's been busy." He held out a small bundle wrapped in oil paper. Inside lay 7 miniature lanterns, each no bigger than a teacup, exquisitely made. One was painted with Master Zhao's face, eyes scratched out. Another showed Little Swallow hanging from the cypress. The third depicted the boy with the slashed throat. The remaining 4 were blank, waiting, found nailed to the door of every surviving master craftsman, Hastings said grimly, with this pinned beneath. A single sheet of rice paper, the now familiar characters, 4 sorrows paid, 4 still owed. Tonight the moon is red. Bring me the ruby, mother, or the river drinks the house of Li entire. Inspector Zhang exhaled through his teeth. The man is either mad or a genius. "Both," Poirot said, "and running out of time. Come." They moved quickly through the waking village. Lanterns were being repaired after the storm. Children stared with round, frightened eyes. Old women burned paper money at every corner to appease hungry ghosts. The mist muffled every sound, so that voices seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. At the house of Li, they found chaos barely contained. Madame Li stood in the main courtyard surrounded by terrified retainers. Li Weishan was nowhere to be seen. "He is gone," Madame Li said simply when Poirot appeared. Her face was grey parchment. "Left a letter. He says he will return the ruby himself, whatever the cost. He believes if he gives Xian the stone, the killing stops." She held out the letter. The handwriting was frantic, ink blotched with tears or rain. "Mother, I was wrong. I thought disgrace worse than death. I thought a brother's life a fair price for the family name. I have learned otherwise. By moonrise, I will place the heart of the dragon in Gion's hand. Forgive me." Weishan Poirot read it twice. "Where is the ruby hidden, madame?" She hesitated only a heartbeat. "In the ancestral tablet of my husband, behind the spirit, screen in the hall of returning cranes. It was to be my secret until my own death." Inspector Zhang started to speak, but Poirot raised a hand. "No! If Li Weishan has taken it, he rides toward his brother even now, alone, ashamed, desperate. We must reach the smuggler's cave before the brothers meet, or the 5th sorrow will be fratricide." They left immediately. Poirot, Hastings, Inspector Zhang, and 6 armed constables in plain clothes. Mei Ling was brought last, pale but composed, a black shawl over her head like a mourner already. The path to the cave climbed the eastern flank of Dragon's Tongue, treacherous with wet stone and bamboo that clawed like fingers. Mist turned the world into a dream. Every footfall echoed strangely. Halfway up, Mei Ling stopped. "Here," she whispered, a narrow fissure hidden by hanging vines. Inside, the air was cold and wet, smelling of guano and old gunpowder. The smugglers who once brought opium up the river had used it for a century. Inspector Zhang's men lit hooded lanterns. The beams stabbed the dark like golden knives. They moved in single file. The tunnel widened into a natural cavern. At its centre, someone had built a small shrine of river stones. Upon it rested the star-returning lantern, fully assembled now, midnight blue paper glowing faintly in the lamplight, its constellations perfect except for the single crimson star that should have sat at the dragon's heart. And tied to the lantern's bamboo frame with red silk cord was Li Wei-shan. He was alive, barely. His face was swollen with bruises, his fine Shanghai suit torn and filthy. A gag of prayer cloth had been stuffed in his mouth. At his feet lay the ruby star, no larger than a pigeon's egg, blazing like a coal even in the dim light. He saw them and began to struggle, eyes wild. From the shadows stepped Li Jian. He had changed almost beyond recognition, hair long and matted, face burned dark by sun and madness, eyes luminous with fever. He wore the same dark European coat Poirot had glimpsed on the first night, now patched and filthy. In his right hand he held an old army revolver, in his left a burning joss stick. "Too late," he said softly. His voice was the same, yet hollow, as though the mountain had eaten part of it. "The 5th sorrow is almost complete." Mei Ling made a small, wounded sound. Li Jian's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment something human struggled behind the madness. "You brought them," he said, not accusation, only sorrow. "I told you to come alone." "I brought mercy," she answered, stepping forward. "Jian, look at your brother. Look what this has made of you. It is enough." Li Jian laughed, a terrible sound that echoed off stone. "Enough! They stole my name, my birthright, my life. They drowned me in the river and told the world I ran away with a dancing girl. 3 years I clung to roots in the gorge, eating frogs, waiting for the festival that would let me return. And now the ancestors themselves demand payment." He touched the burning joss stick to the star-returning lantern's base. The special oil soaked into the paper caught instantly. Blue fire raced upward along secret channels. "In minutes the greatest lantern in Lanterna will become a torch," he said almost gently. "It will rise through the cave mouth at moonrise, carrying the ruby star and my brother's body. The house of Li will burn in the sky for all the province to see. Poetic, no?" The revolver lifted, centered on Wei-shan's temple. Poirot stepped forward into the firelight. "Poetic, yes," he said calmly, "but incomplete. You have forgotten one small detail, mon ami." Li Jian's eyes narrowed. "And what is that, little detective?" Poirot smiled, the small cat-like smile that had ended 100 cases. "That Hercule Poirot never forgets the human heart, even when it is broken." He reached slowly into his pocket and drew out the child's fingerbone from the forbidden pavilion. "This belonged to the prince's daughter, did it not? The one your ancestor murdered for the ruby. You have carried her vengeance as faithfully as any monk carries scripture. But tell me, Li Jian, when the lantern burns and your brother dies, will the little girl's ghost be satisfied? Or Will she simply ask for one more sorrow, and one more, until no Li remains at all? The revolver wavered. Mei Ling moved then, swift as a swallow herself, and placed her hand over Li Jian's on the gun. "Come back," she whispered. "Come back to me. The river gave you a second life. Do not waste it on fire." For an endless moment, the only sound was the soft roar of the burning lantern. Then, very slowly, Li Jian let the revolver fall. It clattered on stone like a breaking spell. Inspector Zhang's men rushed forward. Wei Shan was cut free, sobbing like a child. The lantern, half consumed, was torn down and smothered beneath wet cloaks. Li Jian stood motionless while irons were locked around his wrists. Only once did he speak. "The ruby," he said, looking at his mother, who had appeared silently at the cave mouth, flanked by guards. "Return it to the river where it belongs." Madame Li's face was a mask of grief and relief. She knelt, picked up the glowing stone, and without ceremony hurled it into the underground stream that fed Mirror Lake. It vanished with a small, final plop. Mist began to lift outside the cave, revealing the first pale wash of dawn. Poirot watched the brothers, one weeping, one empty-eyed, being led away into the growing light. "Love and hate," he murmured to Hastings, "so often the same flame, merely viewed from different sides." Behind them, the ruined star-returning lantern smouldered gently, its constellations turning to black lace. The festival still had one night to go. Chapter 8. Unravelling the Lantern Code. The day of the Lovers' Festival dawned clear and mercilessly bright, as though the mountain itself wished to wash away the blood of the night before. Lanterna Village buzzed with a strange, brittle gaiety. Red lanterns, tens of thousands of them, had been hung overnight in every tree, along every roof ridge, across every bridge. Lovers tied silk ribbons to bamboo poles. Children released tiny heart-shaped balloons that drifted upward like drops of fresh blood. Music floated everywhere, pipa, flute, the sweet sorrow of the erhu. Yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of dread. Everyone knew 3 people had died horribly. Everyone knew the mad second son of the Li family had been captured in the cave. And everyone knew the final night, the night of the star-returning lantern, was still to come. In the great courtyard of the House of Li, Hercule Poirot stood before a table covered with evidence. Arranged in precise rows were the charred remains of the star-returning lantern, saved from the cave the 7 miniature sorrow lanterns found nailed to doors, the black paper stars and the gold paper stars, the child's finger bone, the blood-stained notes, Master Zhao's paintbrush still flecked with sacred indigo, Little Swallow's final white lantern, and, at the very centre, the lantern knife with its etched constellations. Around the table stood the surviving principals, Madame Li, pale but regal in mourning white, Li Wei Shan, bandaged and hollow-eyed, Mei Ling, wrists lightly bound with silk cord at her own request, Inspector Zhang, and 6 constables, Captain Hastings trying very hard to look useful. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and began to walk slowly around the table, the way a conductor circles an orchestra before the final movement. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly, "last night we prevented a catastrophe, yes. But we have not yet prevented the truth, and truth, like a lantern, must rise." He paused beside the ruined star-returning lantern. "Everyone believed Li Jian murdered to avenge a stolen ruby and a stolen birthright. Everyone was wrong, partly." A ripple of unease passed through the courtyard. "Observe," Poirot continued, lifting the scorched midnight blue paper. "The constellations are perfect, exact copies of the imperial star chart of the Qianlong Emperor. But one star, the crimson one, was never meant to be returned to the lantern at all. It was a signal, a code used by river smugglers 100 years ago. A red star painted on blue paper meant only one thing. Cargo ready, send boats at moonrise. Inspector Zhang leaned forward sharply. You are saying the Li family has been smuggling again? Précisément. Opium first, then antiquities, and for the last 5 years, something far more profitable. Rare orchids and jade taken illegally from Burma across the mountain passes. The star-returning lantern was the perfect cover. Once a century, the largest lantern in the province rises above Mirror Lake. Who would notice a few extra packages tied beneath it to be cut, free and collected by waiting boats in the dark? Madame Li's face drained of the last of its colour. Poirot turned to her gently. You knew nothing of this, madame. The smuggling began 3 years ago, when your second son disappeared. Or rather, when he pretended to disappear. He lifted one of the miniature sorrow lanterns, the one depicting Master Zhao with scratched-out eyes. These were not warnings from a ghost. They were receipts, payment demands. Master Zhao was the master craftsman who built the false bottom into the great lantern each year. Little Swallow wrote the secret instructions that went with it. The boy delivered messages. When they threatened to confess, they were silenced, permanently. Li Wei-shan made a strangled sound. You are saying my brother, your brother, Poirot interrupted, discovered the smuggling ring run by persons unknown. He tried to stop it. They attempted to kill him, threw him into the gorge. He survived barely, and for 3 years has been trying to expose the criminals the only way he knew how, by turning their own code against them. Mei Ling spoke for the first time, voice raw. Jian never wanted blood. He wanted the smugglers to believe the ancestors themselves were angry. The sorrow lanterns, the stars, the messages, all to frighten them into stopping. When they killed Master Zhao instead, he lost his mind for a time. Poirot nodded. And you, mademoiselle, helped him. You painted the miniature lanterns. You left the black stars. You carved the warnings, but you never meant murder. He picked up the lantern knife and turned it so the light caught the etched constellations. This knife belonged to the real leader of the smugglers. Observe the missing crimson star on the blade, exactly where it should be on the lantern. A signature. He spun suddenly toward the back of the courtyard, where a man in the plain indigo robe of a house steward had been standing quietly all this time. Monsieur Chen Bokai, Poirot said pleasantly, or should I say, Captain Chen of the River Dragon Triad. You have been Madame Li's most trusted steward for 12 years. You arranged everything. The hidden compartments, the midnight boats, the bribes to officials. When Master Zhao grew frightened and threatened to confess, you poisoned him and staged the dramatic discovery in the lake. You hanged poor Little Swallow to terrify the others. You cut the boy's throat when he ran to Mei Ling for help, and you let a broken man take the blame. The steward's face remained impassive, but his hand slid toward his sleeve. Inspector Zhang's constables moved faster. In moments Chen was on his knees, wrists bound with his own belt. Madame Li stared at the man who had served her tea every morning for a decade, as though seeing a stranger wearing a familiar skin. You used my house, she whispered. Chen spat blood onto the flagstones. Your house was built on pirate gold, old woman. I merely continued the tradition. Poirot ignored him. He lifted the final piece of evidence. A torn fragment of midnight blue paper recovered from the cave, showing the dragon constellation with its crimson star carefully painted in fresh blood. Li Jian's last message, Poirot said quietly. He knew who the real killer was. He tried to tell us with the only means left to him, by completing the code. The red star returned to its place. The smugglers exposed. He turned to Li Jian, who had been brought from the temporary prison cell, pale and unshackled, flanked by 2 guards. "You have suffered greatly, mon ami, but you are not blameless. Vengeance, even righteous vengeance, has a way of becoming the very evil it fights." Li Jian met his mother's eyes for the first time. Something wordless passed between them. Grief, forgiveness, exhaustion. Poirot stepped back. "The murders stop here. The smuggling stops tonight. And the star-returning lantern, what remains of it, will rise one final time, carrying neither jewels nor contraband, but only the truth." He looked up at the sky, where the sun was already beginning its descent toward the final festival night. "Come," he said to Hastings, "we have a lantern to rebuild, and this time, mon vieux, we will fill it with something the river has never carried before. Mercy." Behind him, the courtyard slowly emptied. The guilty led away in chains, the innocent left to weep or wonder. Somewhere, a single red lantern, released too early by a child, drifted across the blue sky like a drop of blood that had decided, after all, not to fall. Chapter 9. Confrontation under the full moon. The final night of the Lantern Festival arrived like the climax of a long and terrible opera. Mirror Lake had become a bowl of black glass. Every tree, every bridge, every upturned face was reflected in it, so that the world seemed doubled. One lanterna on earth, one suspended upside down in the sky. 100,000 red lanterns glowed for lovers. 10,000 white ones honored the dead. And above them all hung the full moon, swollen and golden, so bright that shadows looked cut out of velvet. At the center of the lake rose the ceremonial barge, scarlet and gold, draped in dragon banners. Upon it stood the rebuilt star-returning lantern. It was smaller than legend claimed, half the size of the original, hastily reconstructed by the surviving apprentices under Poirot's exacting eye, yet still magnificent. Midnight blue paper painted with silver constellations, the crimson star now restored to the dragon's heart, not as a signal for crime, but as a promise of atonement. On the eastern bank, in a natural amphitheatre of stone, the entire village had gathered. Thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder, silent for once. Even the provincial governor had returned, flanked by soldiers who looked uneasy in their modern uniforms among so many ghosts. Hercule Poirot stood at the focus of every gaze on a small wooden platform built specially for the release. He wore formal evening dress beneath a ceremonial robe of imperial yellow, an honor Madame Li had insisted upon. His moustaches were magnificent, his expression serene. Behind him, in a semicircle, stood the survivors. Madame Li, straight-backed in mourning. White turned ceremonial silver, Li Weishan and Li Jian side by side. Brothers again, pale, unspeaking, wrists still raw from yesterday's chains. Mei Ling, head high, eyes shining with unshed tears. Captain Hastings trying not to fidget Inspector Zhang, and a dozen constables, and, in iron shackles between 2 guards, Chen Bo-kai, the steward smuggler, face twisted with hatred. A single drum began to beat, slow, solemn, ancient. Poirot raised both hands. Silence fell so complete that the creak of lantern wires sounded like thunder. "People of Lanterna," he began in flawless Mandarin, his voice carrying to the furthest ridge. 200 years ago, your village was founded on a lie. A pirate became a patriarch. Blood was buried beneath silk and incense. For 7 generations, the star-returning lantern has risen to hide that shame. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. 3 nights ago, that shame tried to drown you all in fresh blood. 3 innocent people died, because greed and fear are heavier than any lantern. Tonight we end the lie." He turned to the lantern. Inside its heart, instead of a secret wish or contraband, the apprentices had placed a simple scroll of rice paper. On it, in Little Swallow's perfect calligraphy, copied by her grieving teacher, were written the names of the dead: Master Zhao, Little Swallow, the boy with the dragon's eye painted by his toes. Poirot took a long candle from a waiting acolyte and touched it to the lantern's base. Flame raced upward. The great sphere lifted gently from its cradle, trailing a ribbon of gold fire. It rose slowly at first, then faster, catching the wind that always, on this night, blew upward from the lake toward the stars. Higher, higher. Every face tilted skyward. Tears glittered on 1,000 cheeks. When the lantern was no more than a bright coin against the moon, Poirot spoke again, quietly this time, yet every soul heard him. "Chen Bo Kai," he said, turning to the shackled steward, "you used beauty to hide ugliness. You murdered to protect profit. Look now at what your greed has cost." He gestured, and the constables forced Chen forward to the edge of the platform. Above them, the star-returning lantern reached its apex. For one heartbeat, it hung motionless beneath the moon, perfect, radiant, terrible. Then, exactly as Poirot had arranged hours earlier, with gunpowder and silk cord, a series of small charges hidden in the frame burst in perfect sequence. The lantern did not explode in violence. Instead, it unfolded, like a flower opening its petals to the night. Hundreds of tiny paper doves, white for the dead, crimson for atonement, spilled from its heart and fluttered downward in a slow, shining rain. The crowd gasped, then wept openly. One dove landed on Madame Li's outstretched palm. Another settled on Li Jian's shoulder. A third drifted straight to Mei Ling, who caught it against her heart. Chen Bo Kai stared upward, mouth working soundlessly. Something in his face cracked, not repentance perhaps, but the realization that his empire of fear had been undone by paper birds. Inspector Zhang stepped forward. "Chen Bo Kai, you are under arrest for murder, smuggling, and corruption. The sentence will be carried out at dawn." Chen lunged suddenly, wildly, trying to throw himself into the lake. The guards caught him easily. His scream was thin, animal, lost beneath the rising roar of the crowd, not anger now, but release. Poirot paid him no further attention. He turned instead to the brothers. Li Weishan dropped to his knees before Li Jian. "I tried to kill you," he said, voice breaking. "I paid men to throw you into the gorge. Forgive me, or kill me. I deserve no less." Li Jian looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he knelt too, so that the two brothers faced each other on the same level. "I already forgave you," he said hoarsely, "the night the river gave me back my life." They embraced, awkward, shaking, real. Around them, the village exhaled a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Madame Li stepped forward last. She placed one hand on each son's head, the way she must have done when they were small boys fighting over mooncakes. "The ancestors have their ruby," she said quietly. "Now let them have their peace." Above them, the last of the paper doves drifted down like snow. The empty frame of the star-returning lantern, its work finished, caught a final updraft and spiraled high, higher than any lantern in living memory, until it became a new star, small, brave, and finally truly returning. Poirot watched it vanish, and for once the little Belgian detective had nothing clever to say. Captain Hastings cleared his throat. "Well, old chap, justice, eh? Truth rising and all that. Rather poetic." Poirot's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Poetic?" he murmured. "Non, mon ami, human. Simply, terribly, beautifully human." Somewhere in the crowd, a single flute began to play. The old festival melody of departure and return. One by one, 10,000 lanterns were released over the lake until the water itself seemed to burn with reflected hope. The Festival of Lanterns was over, and Lanterna, for the first time in 200 years, slept beneath a sky that belonged only to the stars. Chapter 10. The Final Lantern's Light. The morning after the last night of the festival, Lanterna Village belonged to silence and smoke. Thin grey ribbons rose from 1,000 household shrines where paper money still burned for the newly dead. The lake lay dull and ordinary under a pale winter sun, littered with the skeletons of spent lanterns, charred bamboo ribs, scraps of crimson and gold paper floating like dead lotus. Even the mountains seemed to have drawn a breath and held it. Hercule Poirot took his leave from the house of Lee at an hour when most of the household was still asleep. He walked alone down the winding stone path, cane tapping softly, valise carried by a single silent servant who knew better than to speak. At the great vermilion gate, he paused. Madame Lee waited there, dressed not in mourning white nor ceremonial silver, but in simple indigo, the colour of ordinary days that must now begin again. "You gave us back our souls, Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she offered him a small package wrapped in dark blue silk. A poor token. Poirot accepted it with a bow. Inside was a lantern no larger than his palm, perfect midnight blue paper painted with the complete dragon constellation, the crimson star, now only a faint, healed scar. "It will never fly," she explained. "We will make no more star-returning lanterns. The lie is finished. But we wished you to have something that once carried truth." Poirot turned the little lantern in his fingers. "Truth is the only cargo worth carrying, madame, and sometimes the heaviest." From the courtyard came the sound of voices. 2 male voices, low, halting, learning how to be brothers again. Li Wei-shan and Li Jian were sweeping the flagstones side by side, a penance they had chosen themselves. Mei Ling watched from the lotus pond, scattering rice for the koi, her face unreadable, but no longer sharp with grief. Madame Li followed his gaze. They will stay. Wei Shan has resigned his Shanghai directorships. Jian will teach the village boys to read, something he always wished to do before everything. The House of Li will become a school, a small atonement. Poirot nodded approvingly. "The best families, madame, are those that learn to fall and then to rise without wings." He was about to step through the gate when running footsteps made him turn. Mei Ling reached him breathless, cheeks flushed from the cold. In her hands she carried one last object, a simple red festival lantern, the kind lovers release together. "I never gave you my wish," she said, suddenly shy. "Will you take it with you?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Mademoiselle, Hercule Poirot is a bachelor by conviction and moustache maintenance. Wishes are dangerous things in my profession." She laughed, the first true laugh he had heard from her, and pressed the lantern into his free hand anyway. "Then let it be my wish for you, that wherever you go next, someone is waiting with hot coffee and no corpses." He tucked the red lantern carefully beside the blue one in his valise. "Accepted," he said gravely, "though I make no promises about the corpses." The little train for the provincial capital was already whistling in the valley when Poirot reached the station. Captain Hastings waited on the platform, looking relieved to be leaving mountains and murder behind. As the train pulled away, Poirot stood at the window of their compartment and watched Lanterna shrink to a handful of red roofs and drifting smoke. Hastings offered him a newspaper. Poirot waved it away. "Tell me, mon ami," he said instead, "do you believe in wishes?" "Good Lord, no," Hastings replied automatically, then caught himself. "Well, perhaps one or two." Poirot opened the valise and took out the small red lantern. With delicate care, he lit the candle inside. The compartment filled with soft crimson light. "Then let us grant Mademoiselle her wish, at least in part." He slid the window down. Cold mountain air rushed in. Together they released the lantern into the bright morning. It rose swiftly, joyously, a single red heartbeat against the vast pale sky, climbing higher than the train, higher than the mountains, until it became indistinguishable from the sun itself. Poirot closed the window and settled back with a small, satisfied sigh. "Another case concluded," Hastings said cheerfully. "Rather a good show all round, what?" Poirot smoothed his moustaches and permitted himself the faintest of smiles. "Not concluded, mon vieux. Redeemed. There is a difference." The train gathered speed, rattling southward toward new cities, new crimes, new impossible things. Behind it, the little red lantern sailed on, carrying a village girl's hope across provinces and rivers and years. And somewhere far below, in a courtyard that would soon echo with children's voices instead of ghosts, two brothers looked up and watched it go. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The final lantern had risen, and for the first time in 200 years, it carried nothing but light.